Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is one that I've been looking forward to for a long time. I am talking to Dmitri Siegel. Dmitri is currently the Vice President of Global Brand at Sonos and was previously the Executive Creative Director at Patagonia. He also worked on design and creative direction for brands like Urban Outfitters and Sundance. But before all that, Dmitri was one of my favorite writers in the sort of Emigre-era of design criticism. He's published essays in Emigre, but also in places like ... and was a regular contributor to Design Observer. I was really interested in talking to Dmitri about this career arc, about how one goes from writing for Emigre to leading design at a global brand like Sonos. But I was also interested in his own relationship to design writing and how this background plays a role in the kinds of work that he's doing now. We also talk about his thoughts on the state of design criticism today and how it's changed from when he was writing often. We talk about being critical in an in-house design team and the types of writing that he's always aspired to. Like I said, I had been looking forward to this one for a while. When I started this podcast, Dmitri was one of the people that I wanted to talk to right from the beginning, and I'm so glad we finally got to talk, and it was a pleasure to hear his thoughts on all of these things that I love talking about. So I hope that you also enjoy my conversation with Dmitri Siegel. Like I was kind of saying before we started recording, you're somebody, as soon as I started this podcast, you were someone that was on my list of someone I wanted to talk to. And you were one of my favorite writers during that kind of mid-2000s design blog boom. And then I kind of didn't hear from you for a while. I kind of had lost track of where you were. And a couple years ago, I was reading something and your name was in the article, and I was like, hey, what happened to him? And Googled you, and you were like, vice president of something at Patagonia. I was like, this is the strangest career trajectory I have ever seen. And so not to ask a kind of weird first question, but I'd kind of like to pick apart how someone goes from kind of Yale MFA writing for these kind of alternative publications like ... and Emigre to leading brand at, Patagonia or Sonos or something like that. So let's kind of start a little bit with maybe Yale, or where your interest in design came from, or what your kind of early entry into the design field looked like.
Sure. I started out as a fine artist, so I was a painting major in undergrad,
Okay.
but I was always interested in technology. So I did like a sort of a paintings go into the computer and you can user generate your own version of the painting kind of thing in 1994.
Yeah.
That was kind of my my art at the time. So I always had this interest in art and technology and music, and all those three things, I think, especially at that time, were just, a lot of people were really interested in those things. So after undergrad, I went to New York and was an artist, and was also teaching art as a way to make a living. And it was during this whole technology boom, and so there was so much opportunity to kind of look at the interplay between culture, the arts, and technology.
Right.
And I got involved in a couple software companies at that time that were specifically around like the museums and bringing the museum experience online. And I had actually I'd been teaching in museums. That was the art teaching I was doing. So it's this thing where you're like really seeing the analog world go digital, and seeing how like even something like teaching art, design and technology were making that. We're really disrupting it and really making that a faster, more interesting kind of space than being a museum docent, which was
Yeah.
my career path at that point.
Right.
And so that's really what led me back to graduate school. I was doing like paintings about technology. I was working at a technology company. We were designing software. So it was sort of like, okay, I want to really bring this together more. And I think that's like, especially at that time, was very much in the job description of a
Yeah.
designer. A
Yeah.
lot of these things that are now specialties were, I wrote a thing that you might have read called Designers as Dilettantes, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
of that was about myself. That
Right.
it was okay to be a dilettante as a designer at that time because you were one of the few people who knew how to use technology to make things. So I'd say that's kind of what drew me into the field of design, and in some sense, as you go from there, what made my career path take the course that it took.
So when you decided to go back to school, how this is going to sound kind of strange, but how aware of what graphic design was were you in these jobs you were doing? Were you working closely with designers? Like that was very clearly the thing that could bring these things together for you.
I was aware of design as a kid because my mom was a cartographer for National
Oh,
Geographic
oh wow.
magazine. So I grew up in a making a magazine environment
Okay.
with designers and photo editors and writers and kind of that team, of creative people working on a project. So I was aware of design, as a kid, and my parents both had taken calligraphy in college with they went to Reed
Oh yeah.
where Steve Jobs
Yeah.
went, and they studied calligraphy there, and so they had amazing handwriting.
Oh wow.
And that was like a huge influence on me. I think just they cared a lot about letters, and they cared a lot about how, writing looked. And so there was a lot of it that was already sort of in there.
Okay.
But I think at that time, yeah, you were starting to realize that everything was going to be translated into a two-dimensional form.
Right.
Like all these things that were formerly three-dimensional experiences or, books or whatever, they were all going to be like translated into like digital magazine like things. So yeah, certainly like watching one of the software companies I worked for was called the Museum System, and it was basically a collections management software
Okay.
for museums. So you're like, oh wait, the whole museum is just going to be this
Right.
database at some point.
Right.
Like,
Right.
um,
Oh, that's so interesting. So when you finished at Yale, what were you thinking, or what kind of career were you looking for, kind of right at that graduation moment?
um, I think it was, didn't really know.
Yeah.
I took what I could, what options were there and kind of
Yeah.
considered them. And I was really fortunate that one of my professors at Yale, Kira Alexandra, hired me at Sundance Channel. I had loved doing motion work, and I loved the storytelling component of it, and I loved that I was coming again into an industry that was being digitized, and
Right.
so that network, the idea of a network was moving from a channel to, broadcast and online and out of home and print and all these things. So and she was just like remains like one of my mentors and inspirations as a
Yeah.
designer. And so she gave me that first opportunity, and then that allowed me to see like motion work and digital work and kind of brand management, which is what she was really
Right.
doing
Right.
for that brand.
So
I
when
was lucky.
yeah, I mean it's actually really I don't want to say it takes some of the fun out of this journey, but it's like, oh, all of these things that you're probably doing now were actually there from the beginning. It sounds like.
I think there's an omnivorous quality. Like I didn't go to design as an undergrad. I went to
Yeah.
liberal arts, and as a liberal arts student, you learn how to learn. And both my parents had big career changes in their life. My mom was a
Oh
philosophy
wow.
professor, and then
Okay.
went to National Geographic. So there was just this
That's
sense
amazing.
of like life's a journey. You always learn new
Yeah, yeah,
things. And I think that's probably what's led to such a seemingly odd
yeah.
career path. I think it's also that just the world keeps getting disrupted. I mean, it's happening
Right.
faster now than
Yeah.
ever, but it's been
Yeah.
happening my whole adult life. So even if I had said, and I think, if I had been at Sundance Channel and been like, this is it, cable TV, I love it, like, where would
Right.
I be now, right? There's no
Right.
such thing.
Right.
So,
So where I mean, it's interesting how these things are starting to fit together, but now I'm really curious where the writing piece came in, or where and how you started writing, or even writing about design, how that kind of fits into all of this.
I mean, I think it's similar to you that when I wasn't in the design world, that writing was the way I got access to it.
Yeah.
And graphic design's all around you, but writing was the way I got a perspective on what was good or not. And it was
Right.
same with music, right? Like
Yeah.
you'd read zines and stuff to find out what was actually good
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's music everywhere,
That's
but
a
you
good
wanted
point.
to have that critical perspective on it. And writing was that thing, the Stephen Heller books, Looking Closer
Yeah.
books, like, pre-blog, pre-internet. Those were really the things. And if I could, if I found something in like Wire or something that was like about design, it
Yeah.
was a different, um, Emigre, obviously,
Right.
like those were my access point into like, okay, what's good design, or what's the dialogue about design right now?
And then did you have a an interest in not just consuming that, but being a part of that dialogue, or contributing to that dialogue in some way?
Um, Definitely. I mean, I think like writing is still such a big part of, I think written communication is just, it's almost like the most primal form of communication, or the most, the rudimentary, not in a bad way, but kind of like, Kraftwerk is the
Right.
ultimate distillation of electronic music.
Yeah.
Writing is the ultimate distillation of communication. So, um, and I like a good argument. I mean, I think like I like to, sort of having that critical perspective, and
Hmm.
writing really gives you license to kind of be rhetorical,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
isn't always encouraged in the workplace. It's always not always the
Right.
best thing to do at work.
Right.
But you sit
Yeah.
down to write an essay, and you're completely have license to really argue a
Hmm.
distinct point of view.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm really, curious where that has gone, to be honest. The essay as a format, the blog explosion, really provided a lot of bandwidth for people to write in that
Yeah.
format,
Right.
which is very like sustainable practice, right? Like it's super intense focus for a couple of weeks, and then you're done and you can
Right.
go do other stuff. And then it turned into like, shorter and shorter bits constantly, and just like this churn of tiny little things. And that's just like was burnout to me. Like I couldn't, it wasn't satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you? I mean that. This is something that I wanted to kind of talk to you about later in the conversation, but actually really makes sense here. I'm a lot of those writers that I kind of, or a lot of those designers even that I, were first introduced to through those blogs 15 years ago now. My first introduction to them was actually as writers, not as designers. And so someone like yourself, I read your words before I ever saw any of the actual kind of work that you did. And so many of those people have stopped writing or are writing less frequently and are now, kind of very much designers, or just kind of not a part of that conversation anymore, or the conversation, if there even is a conversation anymore. And was that a conscious decision for you to kind of move away from that, or is that something that just kind of, the conversations moved to different places and you just kind of were doing your thing? You know what I mean
Yeah,
by
yeah.
that?
I
That's a
mean,
weird question.
I'm kind of just as curious about it as you are. I mean,
Okay.
I definitely still like long to write in that way, and I would love to still make it part of my life. So part of it is just me being, letting other things get in the way of it.
Yeah.
I'm also just like confused about if that is still going on anymore. Like I'm certainly not as plugged into it. I mean, I check in with, my old haunts, but like, is there
Yeah.
a vibrant like criticism scene right now? I mean, I teach, at various grad programs periodically and go through, and like I don't get the sense that there is that publications are really like where that conversation is happening anymore. But I'm also just
Yeah.
out of touch, so I
Yeah.
could be
I
wrong.
mean, no, I think you're right. And if if I've learned anything from these conversations that I'm having for this podcast, I kind of started the podcast with this idea that the world needed more design criticism or more design writers or more people talking about design. And as I've talked to people, I've come to realize that more people are probably talking about design, quote unquote, graphic design than ever before. I'm sure you see this when Sonos has a new thing, and then everyone on Twitter has immediate commentary on that thing, and that's where a lot of the problem is that the general public, non-designers are aware of this, designers are aware of this, but now it's just 140 characters instead of, like you mentioned earlier, the essay format or something that's a little bit deeper or a little more considered. And then because it's all on Twitter, there's not these kind of centralized places for it, and so it's all just kind of just being thrown out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I watched it happen in a way real time where when Jessica and Bill first started Design Observer, you'd spend a lot of time on the essay, and then we would spend a lot of time on our comments on each other's posts. Like I would spend a day writing a comment, and then it just got faster and stupider and faster and stupider, and it's like, and that's where the thoughtfulness kind of dissipated from the comment section anyway.
Right.
And so the dialogue was much different there. And I think it's a medium thing too. I mean, I think if there is going to be, a sort of a what's the word I want to use? It's like, I think a long-term conversation or like a continuous conversation, podcast is probably a medium where it could happen again. But
fingers crossed.
Magazines and blogs aren't really going to be able to sustain a thoughtful conversation anymore. And that's interesting. I think also like the role of technology. I always look at design and typography as like the translation of the human voice through a mechanical process. And we're moving into this period where voice is actually the mechanical means through which the human voice is going to get translated. And so, voice control and podcast and this stuff, we're almost entering an era when sound and the direct translation of your voice might become the dominant form, which will be weird for designers because it's going to be a less visual thing.
Yeah, I mean, that was super weird for me. This podcast was my MFA thesis project, and it was not visual at all. And that's what I've trained to do, and I had to kind of like wrestle with that for a while.
I think you're right on the edge of it, of where where things are going, to be honest. I have a 10-year-old kid and a 5-year-old kid. My 10-year-old is obsessed with a phone. My 5-year-old just talks to his speaker. It's like he doesn't even want a phone. He's like, it's cool. I just ask for it.
Yeah,
it happens.
It's funny you mentioning the comment section reminded me. As I was kind of preparing for this conversation, I reread a piece you had written, and I'm sorry to kind of bring up probably essays that you haven't read in 10 or 15 years.
I read them every night. What are you talking about?
Okay, good. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was something that you wrote. I don't know where it was published originally, but it was about Design Observer and Speak Up, and it was about Bill and Jessica's AIGA keynote. And you mentioned the comments in that and how you get a good 24 hours of kind of solid discussion, and then it just devolves into personal attacks or short kind of statements, which really this was way before Twitter, and you kind of were noticing that then. But what really struck me about that piece and a couple other things that I had reread recently was how much you wrote about the discourse and about what design criticism should be. I have the issue of Emigre where Rudy interviews you about your I guess it was kind of a review of the rant issue, and you're kind of talking about this, and it's all the same questions that I'm asking now 10, 15 years later. Were you feeling that? I kind of want to know what it, as somebody who was, essentially a kid when these things were coming out, it's easy for me to look at that era, to look at the 90s especially, and even, my high school years in the early 2000s as the kind of golden age of design criticism. But then here you were kind of talking about a lot of the problems and other people talking about the problems with that discourse. What was that kind of like for you to kind of be a practicing designer, new in the field, and then wanting a kind of richer design criticism?
I mean, I think one of the first things I wrote, or maybe it was, I forget where it surfaced, but like the question for me is the same question that you have, is like, can you be a designer and a writer at the same time? And there were obviously people in my life who were, like Michael and Jessica and Bill, who were writers and designers, and but it was really a question. There was them, and then there was like Stuart Bailey at dot 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 and Paul Elliman at dot dot dot. But I was like, are they really designers? Like. And then with, to some extent with Bill and Jessica, I was like, are they really designers? Like, do you, and then there was like Stephen Heller, who was like, not a designer really, he's just doing writing. So like that, like, trying to do those two things at the same time was definitely, I think, similar to you, was like, I really wanted to be able to do those two things. And so I was very critically like assessing, like, is this possible? And I think that, there had been this, I would say I was at the tail end of the glory days of design criticism for sure. And watching it, get disrupted. There was the Looking Closer series that Bill and Michael Beirut did. Like there was a canon, there was like, you make it into one of those books and then that's what people will read. And, there was not, then the blogs kind of maintained that for a while. But then it really started fragmenting. And, I remember when Rob went and did Lined and Unlined, and I was like, oh, this is like taking a whole leg of the stool away, like, okay, now I got to check 3 blogs,
Yeah.
So
That's right.
And I think it just further, fragmented from there. I mean, I hope that it's still going on. And like I said, it's something that I always like kind of long to check back into.
Yeah.
I find that that at least for me, the best things that I did after I became a professional designer were these overlaps between criticism and design. And that led to, I think, some of the most important, like actual practical, like things that I wrote about. They were less academic, obviously, because they were based on like, okay, this is really a thing. Like, what do we do about plastic bags, and are canvas bags really, like, is that really a solution?
Yeah.
Or stuff like that. I've seen you be able to thread back and forth, but to really like, I personally haven't been able to sustain like a prolific writing career and a prolific professional career.
But were those overlaps that you're talking about? Are you? Do you mean that the writing was actually came out of kind of design projects you were working on, where they were so integrated, or what exactly kind of are you talking about with those overlaps? Because that's something that's really interesting to me also.
Yeah, I think like, there's a couple of pieces in there. They're probably the later pieces that I wrote on Design Observer, where I'd be like seeing something at work and noticing a pattern or noticing a shift, and like that was actually happening in the practice of design, and then using that as the starting point of something, And so for me, the way I wrote was always like there was some like pattern recognition or something that would start it, and then it was about like the journey that you went on from there. And like when those things started in my practice versus being in school, I think they were, I guess like the school work was more relevant to people who are in school,
Right.
So I think if you were like, that's what Michael does so well. Michael Beirut is like, he's like, I was working on this op-ed thing for the New York Times. They're like, well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I'm pretty interested already,
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I've gotten kind of different perspectives on that question. When I talked to Michael about that, he was kind of very open and saying, almost everything he's written has come out of something that he was actually wrestling with in his own design work. And then I talked to Michael Rock, who said that he very consciously tries to keep 2x4 work out of any kind of writing that he does. And so, it's kind of interesting of how those things fit together, and then also the kind of I don't know, the distance between the writing and the work.
Totally. I mean, those are such great examples too. I was so happy to see Michael's book come out, and just see him back in it. And they're very different voices in design writing. So I think, I don't know. I mean, for me, like the writing and the more academic stuff, it's just an opportunity to be more abstract in the connections that you make, and to be more speculative in what you're thinking about and working on. So if you can start, if it can like intersect with actual work, that I think grounds it more for people. But Michael Beirut is definitely like, his work is not, you can't misinterpret it for anything other than about graphic design. It's about graphic design.
Right.
And some of the other writers like Paul Elliman or Stewart or David Reinford or Michael Rock, or you're like, is this about life?
Yeah.
Is this about more than design?
Yeah.
And it really it is in a lot of ways. So, it's different voices in the dialogue. That's definitely something that, I think, you mentioned the Emigre piece. I think that was in the last issue of Emigre.
Yeah.
So it's like that ended, that sort of like voices in conversation with one another thing was part of what was really interesting. You'd get like really different voices and personalities kind of rubbing it up against each other in a book or in a magazine, or a single blog that had a good stable of writers, and now everybody kind of has their own channel. You know?
I have two questions that are semi-related that are directly kind of responding to this idea of kind of how it relates to work, or how it relates to graphic design, and I want to kind of connect it to your work now and kind of what you're doing now. And so the first part of the question is, I'm interested. I imagine that your job now involves a lot of writing, and it's probably not essay writing and this kind of academic writing, but how just writing in the largest sense fits into the work that you're doing now, and how those things relate to each other. And then the second part is if you see any connection between the kind of more academic or the essay writing that you had done on Design Observer and Emigre, does that have any effect or has influenced kind of how you think about what you're doing now?
I'll take the second part of the question first. I think I was very fortunate to have the experience of like kind of going for it a little bit and having that work out.
Yeah.
I wrote in a pretty, I didn't like edit it or try to be successful or try to like fit in at all. And then people actually, like a small subculture actually like read it and responded to it. And I think that influences me still. I'm unafraid.
Yeah.
And I do have faith that your work will find an audience. So, a lot of people, I think in marketing and creative, in the creative industry, it's hard to like keep that sense of like, are people going to get this? Is this going to go? Are people going to be like, what the fuck is this?
Right.
And I think I was just, because I had that experience early on, I was like, always shoot for that. Like, don't ever underestimate the audience. And like, I'd rather connect to those people that I really believe in than a general audience. So that was important. I mean, writing, it's surprising to me how like hard like brand strategy is. It's just like way harder than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be like you do the logo, you pick some colors.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of, our culture is so difficult to like penetrate now.
Yeah.
Like you have to like really have a good strategy and a good approach to like the insight that you're going to get after with people. And then if you're leading a big team, you have to be able to express that in a way that people can understand and then they can do it as well, because the brand control isn't possible, and it doesn't work anymore. So you have to like feed an insight and a set of like insights to a team of people all over the world and go like, try to tickle this tension point in your culture. So it's like way, and I think I'm fortunate to work with really smart team and really smart partners, and we probably are too heady about it, like to the point of like it's more for us than for the customer, but there's definitely a lot more in the sort of like marketing and brand side than on the writing side. The strategy piece is like very, I think, the most similar to the work at the writing work that I did, and that's where the writing really happens. I'm working on the brand strategy for Sonos is like, it's like writing something for Design Observer, only a lot harder.
Yeah, I mean, so that's that's interesting to me because, and I don't mean to oversimplify your career at all, but if you look at if you look down your resume and look 10, 15 years ago, it looked like you very easily could have had a pretty good career in academia with teaching and writing and the kind of design work that you were doing. And now being on the marketing brand side, in some ways those seem like, as opposed as they could be. Are there connections between those, do you think?
I don't know. It's interesting. I grew up with academics. So my dad was a professor at Michigan. My mom was a college professor, and there was several moments in my career, like early on, where I was like, should I take this academic job or should I do this commercial job? And both my academic parents were like, definitely go for the commercial job. Like they're like, academia will be there. You can stay connected to that. And I have really enjoyed like, going into the RISD program or working with the students at CalArts or spending that time in that community. It's still incredibly invigorating and inspiring, and like I get a ton out of it, and I think bring a perspective now of having like navigated the corporate world and stuff like that. So I keep that connection going. It's important to me. How connected they are. I mean, certainly like. I remember Scott Stoll, like one of his first classes was about why design is different than advertising.
Right. Yeah.
Like he had, of course, the coolest like graphics of like that explained like why design was better than advertising, basically. And they are, I think that we still make a lot of stuff through design, and I think that's always a strength. So like I always tell people who are designers who are looking for what they're going to do in their careers, like never give up that core of typography and design, because everybody brings something that is their strength into whatever they're doing, and design is just as good as any other one.
Yeah.
It's actually better. That's being sarcastic, but it's actually better than many, and like you can use that skill set and that perspective, and it gives you a unique take. Like when we make campaigns, like we do the poster, the print work is like, I think really better than a lot of other brands because we care about it much more, and I think that works for us. I think the advertising, the sort of TV ads is something that a lot of people do, but we might even take a more designy approach to that. So it's still worked in there. I don't think they're probably as opposite ends of the spectrum as Scott explained them. I mean,
this is I'm about to ask a big question, so I apologize in advance. But what's become a recurring theme in these conversations that I have with people is, as people go through in my own journey as a designer, now 10 years or whatever it's been, and then talking to people who have been designing much longer, how the word design or the words graphic design, that definition has evolved for them over the years. And so, you mentioned David Reinfert. I interviewed him, and he's very kind of on the edge of what we might call graphic design. I'm curious, has it evolved for you, or the way you think about it, or what it is to you?
I do think it's like kind of shrunk, I would say, over the years. Like the core of it was always typography and layout, and I think again in that period of the when I was in graduate school, it had really ballooned a little
Hmm.
bit to be like it's film and producing media, and like it
Right.
had gotten, pretty broad. And now when I think of the tools that we use to, like, either at Patagonia or here to like communicate about a brand, I definitely see like graphic design as one of those things. And I'm probably biased towards, a filmmaker or a writer who has that background, but I see those as design is once again like, okay, that's what graphic design
Right.
is.
And so it's almost so when you say that you do a television spot or a video spot that has a kind of design, um, I forget the word you use, but like a design approach to it. Graphic design is just a tool to achieve that, or a process to achieve that. The video spot is not necessarily graphic design. You think?
Right. And I would,
Okay.
we build a store, we use
Right.
like, three-dimensional designers. I don't think that's graphic design anymore. I think like when we make a website,
Oh, that's interesting.
or
Yeah.
digital project, like that's a digital designer.
Right.
Um, I think that's an interesting background. That's an interesting area where I particularly favor people who have a more traditional background, because I
Yeah.
think there's a sort of two ways that you can arrive at being a digital designer. One is through graphic design or traditional design, where you really just have to figure out how to solve problems with typography
Hmm.
and layout. And then another one is sort of like, I'm really focused on the tech and the sort of like the way things move and
Right.
stuff like that. And where you're sort of content agnostic. And I think that side doesn't work for me, really. Like
Okay.
if it looks cool, but you're not actually like
Right.
getting the content through.
Right.
That one isn't my favorite.
So I have another kind of two-part question that you actually started to answer a little bit in your answer there, because I'm when you're designing a store, um, and you have a very traditional graphic design background, what do you kind of bring to that, or how do you think your background in your career can kind of shape the look of the Sonos store, or the brand at large, that you might not have if you were just a brand guy or a strategist or something.
Um, yeah, probably a lot more graphics than,
Yeah,
like, I
yeah.
mean, I'm fortunate I get to work with Kira on our stores. So,
Oh yeah.
it's a level of continuity there for me too. But
Oh,
like,
interesting.
they're pretty graphic. Like there's big graphics on the
Yeah.
windows. There's big, like there's a sort of a more, I would say, important role for that kind of communication in the store. I mean, there's like design stuff that you always use, like scale and contrast and all that stuff. And to be clear, like I don't design the store. I'm
Right.
like,
Right.
okay, let's work with Partners in Spade, or let's work with Work Order, or let's do this one ourselves. But certainly, like I think it's still a way of differentiating a brand. Like great design isn't, not everybody does it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I can see why now, having worked on a number of brands. It's like it's so hard to make something consistent and make something actually feel like a real thing. And the easiest way to do
Yeah.
that is through a very minimal approach. Like
Yeah.
that is definitely the, like, if I was hiring somebody with my own money, I'd be like, just don't fuck around.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
make this thing consistent, make me look like a real company. But like if you have the patience to actually work through tougher graphic solutions,
Yeah.
like the campaign, that the work that we just launched has all these mouths and all these like patterns.
Oh yeah.
And when we started that, the mouth thing was like, I remember just people being like, "This is never going to work. This looks insane. Like,
Yeah.
what are
Yeah.
you doing?" You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And then just like, but because if you're a designer, you just have to keep hammering away at something like
Right.
that. If you think
Right.
it can work, you have to keep carving away at it and carving away at it and like whittling it down, whittling
Yeah.
it down. And I think that now we ended in a place where it's very iconic and clean and cut through, because we went through that design process, which is not like fun,
Right.
and it's not
Right.
easy or
Right.
cheap. It's like, that's the other thing, is like it's much cheaper to do something, simple
Yeah.
and um, uh, or sort of expected,
Right.
but I think it's still a way to differentiate a brand.
I wanna take that and go back to something you said earlier that intrigued me when you said that you and your team can be kind of heady about the strategy or about kind of the brand voice or kind of brand visuals. And that's exactly another reason why I wanted to talk to you and why I admire a career like yours or even Rob at Google now is I before I went to grad school, my whole career was in-house at Warby Parker for a little bit, and then I was at Facebook for a little bit. And I felt like I didn't have one of the reasons why I left those, as great jobs as they were, is because I didn't have a chance to kind of flex that intellectual side or the more reflexive side. It was just kind of go, 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 get work out. Sometimes it was just about, well, let's just make this look cool because we only have 3 days to do this. And so when I talk to people like yourself or like Rob who come from a kind of very rich like a intellectually rich background, I'm in awe of how you might be able to bring that into this new type of environment because I didn't know how to do it.
Hmm.
Do you find that you have a place to be reflexive about the work or to kind of think about it a little more deeper or more intellectually?
I mean, I think part of it is being really fortunate in who hires you. So I feel like every job I've been hired by, I think this is going to be accurate to say, by a woman who was willing to like let me do that. Like all my bosses have been really smart, really talented
Yeah,
people who are like, okay, you've got this thing where you can be really strategic and you're like thoughtful and critical, and so I'm actually going to let you do that at
yeah.
this job.
Oh,
So
interesting.
like that's like step number one is just being given the opportunity, and you just have
Yeah,
to be grateful for that.
yeah, yeah.
And it's the same here. It's like if you lean into those moments and you lean into those opportunities, and you're like, this is what I'm going to bring to the table. It'll lead to more of those opportunities for you to have that kind of aspect to your work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the writing thing helped with that. I know that like Sue Otto at Urban Outfitters was like one of the first people, was the first person to hire me after Kira, and she got this art magazine that I had done at Yale and had it in my interview. And she
Oh,
was
wow.
asking this dumb like art zine that I did
Yeah,
at
yeah,
Yale. So, and obviously Kira was aware of that too. So I think you get what the work that you're doing now and doing that independent work, gets you self-selected into
right,
jobs where you'll be welcome as
right.
as that kind of person.
I mean, you actually think that that's why people wanted you. I mean, not to make not to make you kind of sound arrogant, but that was a attractive in your resume to have that side of it and not just be a decorator or a kind of really good with kerning or something.
Yeah, that's not really, yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good way to put it. That's not a compliment to me. That's a
yeah,
compliment to Kira and Sue Otto and
right,
Joy and
yeah,
all those leaders who have said like, okay, that's part of what I want in my toolbox.
yeah.
I think about that when I build a team too.
I was
Like,
just
I mean,
gonna ask.
I
Yeah,
think my weakness is in the actual beauty making.
right.
So I always like over index on those people in my team because
Yeah,
I'll handle the chin stroking. I
right,
got that covered.
right. I yeah, that I love that. I mean, I feel like that. I mean, not to. I don't want this to kind of sound bad or that I'm ungrateful of my past career because I loved it and learned a lot. But I think that was the biggest. I think I was too young to understand kind of what I wanted in a career, um, and it's easy to get caught up in the kind of going really fast, working late, just kind of churning work out. And then all of a sudden, I kind of hit this moment where it's like, well, wait, I used to like writing and I used to like kind of thinking about this stuff deeper and I didn't want to just be a decorator. How did I get
Hmm.
that? And the environments didn't kind of allow a place for that. And so it's really nice to hear that, there are kind of people and teams that make that a priority because I don't think a lot of people know that. I think a lot of people think that it is just fast.
Yeah, I mean it is, and obviously, like I haven't been able to do as like basically any writing for the last 5 years, so
Yeah,
don't look to me as an
right.
example of that
Yeah,
by any means. And certainly, I wish I left at 5 o'clock, but
right.
it's the regular job that I do does involve a lot of strategy work and
Yeah,
critical cultural work and stuff. And I think like my whole career has kind of been an attempt to try to integrate my life more and not have things I like to do outside of work and then go to
yeah,
work and do something totally different.
right.
So I think that's been the path to kind of um, making a lot of that happen in the 9 to 5 day.
Yeah. Do you think that that kind of strategy type work that you're doing now, does that feed that desire that you have to write more or to that kind of critical side? Are you getting a lot of that through the work that you're doing?
I think like this job, the Sonos brand is definitely the most fulfilling across all those
Mm,
vectors: visual,
yeah.
creative, strategic, storytelling, 3D. But it is. I am seeing the limits of like. I think I do still have thoughts that are completely outside of the commercial realm, and I
Okay.
have the desire and the interest in like getting pen to paper on those ideas.
Yeah.
I think it's been whatever 15 years of like channeling that into brands,
Yeah.
doing Urban Outfitters brand and then the Patagonia brand and now this brand, and that's been incredibly fulfilling. And I've been fortunate to have and to kind of like go to a brand that was lining up to where my interests were at that
Right.
time, so that like I did this book about environmental
Yeah.
activism, and I was like, okay, Patagonia, there's a brand where I can like channel that into that brand.
Right.
Um, and now I think I'm like reaching a point where I'm like, I kind of like the full abstraction and the
Yeah.
full like consumer of the culture versus trying to like make the culture
Yeah.
um, is beginning to surface again. Of like,
Oh, interesting.
um, you know, for that 15 years, it was about like impacting culture and like being in it. It's been about like trying to make a dent in it, and now it's like that the third person removed like critic perspective
Yeah.
is like starting to come out again for me. So maybe it's a matter of like your phases of your life and your phases of your interest.
Yeah. Do you think there's a place for that in your work? I'm not trying to like, you know, set you up there because I realize that's kind of a weird question talking about the limits of your job in a way, but I'm kind of curious if you think there are ways that you can actually feed that in because you have been able to connect those things
Yeah, I
before.
mean, we absolutely do. Like, it's funny, we're doing a whole thing about test patterns now, and it's like,
Oh, right.
I wrote a whole article about
Yeah.
test patterns like
Yeah.
10 years ago, and I'm like, I seem like the old crank at work. I'm like, you gotta read this thing I wrote about this back in the internet times,
Yeah. I remember
but
that piece. That's so funny.
so I,
Yeah.
I this brand, I mean, what attracted me to it is that
Yeah.
I think my critical perspective is really helpful in this brand being successful. I think
Hmm.
it's about having technology that actually gives you a more enriched life as opposed to something that makes you more of a algorithm or brings more utility to your
Yeah.
life. It's actually like a way of making you more present and culturally connected, and kind of like it's almost like an anti-tech company. So
Right.
that critical edge is like really useful, and it's a kind of marketing that we did at Patagonia too, and I've had the good fortune to work with this guy Doug Holt, who writes about cultural strategy, which is very much about like taking a critical perspective and using that as your slingshot into punching
Right.
above your weight class. Basically, as a
Right.
small brand, you can get a lot more attention by exploiting a cultural perspective, or critical perspective on culture, than by just being like, hooray, our products are good. Like that's very different. It's very expensive to get that message across.
I have just a couple kind of quick questions to kind of wrap all of this up. These are kind of questions that I ask everybody kind of at the end. Um, and the first one I'm going to kind of ask you in two ways because we started talking about it earlier. Because you had mentioned that you would love to kind of get back to writing, or to kind of write like we were talking about before. And so the question that I ask everybody is, what are the issues or the topics or subjects that you would like to see designers or design critics or writers writing and talking about more of? Or what are the issues kind of pressing design right now that people should be talking about and writing about? And so I want to ask you that kind of generally, but then I also kind of want to talk about your own interest in writing. If you were to kind of get back into it, are there things you're thinking about that you wish you had time to write about?
Yeah, I think like what I'm always interested in an article doing is like waking me up to something that
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't quite put my finger on before.
Yeah.
I'm making a connection or an observation that brings something to life that I maybe was on the tip of your tongue or you're in your peripheral vision, but you're like, something's happening here, but I can't quite figure out what it is. And a writer like puts their finger on it and, not explaining it, but kind of bringing it to your attention in a
Right.
clear way. So that's always something that I value in writing, and about the form too, like not just
Right.
the more sort of like socioeconomic underpinnings or the, sort of ideology of design, but that kind of that formal aspect. I feel like we're actually getting to another point of rest where there's something to be said. Like
Yeah.
I think we kind of have gone through a period of we're settling into an aesthetic right now that I feel like somebody needs to go like, what the
Yeah.
fuck? Why are we
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
this? Why is every image full bleed? Why is like all nav floating over an image now? Like what,
Yeah. I'm so
uh,
glad you bring this up right at I could talk to you for another hour about this, about that specifically.
so yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see someone kind of dig into that. I feel like there's a new orthodoxy to be critiqued in that way.
Yeah.
And then I mean, I do think that the role of technology in our lives is the other one where we've hit this like wall on,
Yeah.
and designers we're probably the population, especially my age, that's suffering the most from what we created. And I think there needs to be a sort of generational reevaluation, almost in the same way there is about sexual harassment and stuff, of like, what have we created here? Like a culture that's just like
Yeah.
so easy to consume and has so many adverse, side effects for people's
Yeah.
lives and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Like, and you hear some of the technology people talking about it, like Sean Parker and Elon Musk talking about it, but like,
Right.
I think that's an interesting topic for design criticism right now.
Yeah. That's so interesting. My last question is, I'm very interested in who are the writers or the critics, authors, books, designers who have really influenced you and the way you kind of think about these things, or have kind of influenced the work that you do, or the things that you were writing about.
Hmm. Um, Gosh, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned like the two different kinds of writers, because I always really admired like the directness of like a Michael Beirut and his writing, and at the same time I really loved like the dot 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 kind of
Yeah.
abstraction, and I think a lot of that comes back to Stuart
Yeah.
Bailey as an editor, and that he really would embrace that in you and push you to go ahead, go into that, like, and we'd even joke about it, like how like half the articles in that are people misinterpreting critical theory,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
people sort of understanding it but not really,
Yeah.
or talking
Yeah.
about how they didn't understand it. So I like both those
Yeah.
like strains really, really equally. There's the one essay about free time, that it always, like, I think it just continues to remain relevant to me. It's like there's a few things that I always like ring into the back of my mind, and that's one that was in. I quoted it several times. I think it's on the uses of free time. Um,
Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar.
um, so yeah, that stuff still
Okay.
with me sometimes.
I
Um,
I know I said that was the last question, but now I have one more kind of quick one, because I'm totally with you on that split or that kind of difference between a Michael Beirut essay and a Stuart Bailey essay. And I've interviewed Michael Beirut. I'm actually scheduled to interview Stuart in a couple weeks. And I'm very much attracted to both of their styles and ways of thinking also. And I find myself kind of, I am nowhere near the talented writers as they are, but I kind of, model myself, kind of bounce back and forth between them. What did you always feel more comfortable with?
I certainly in my work sense and the way that I write do copywriting or script writing, I place a high premium on economy of language and directness. I actually have found that is far more rare in communication.
Yeah,
Being out
that's a good point.
and it's partly going back to like what I was saying about like if you're working in a global context, like if you're doing a strategy document or like an idea and it people in another language are going to be like, what the fuck does that mean? Or like they're going to translate it in a weird way, or like it's just going to slow you down in what you're trying to do. So like a lot of what I do with writing now is really to try to boil it down to like I think of like Arnold Lobel or like children's writers who are like they can speak in a way that's like really great for an adult but like easy to understand for a kid. Like the ideas are no less complex in an Arnold Lobel book than in Shakespeare, but like a kid can understand it. So certainly like have found a lot more utility for that kind of writing approach than
that's a good way to
than
think
the other
about
form.
Dmitri, this was so fun. This was great. Like I said at the beginning, you had been on my list as someone to talk to for a while, and I've been following your career and just kind of love what you do and how you think about these things. So thank you so much for this conversation. I thought it was great.
Thank you. It's extremely flattering to hear that from you, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on November 30th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.